The airmen comprising the formidable 8th Air Force quickly learned to regard the menacing bursts of anti-aircraft fire with a dread far exceeding that inspired by enemy fighter aircraft. By the summer months of 1943, the formidable German interceptors, though still dangerous, could often be repelled through the disciplined cohesion of tight bomber formations and the valiant efforts of accompanying escort fighters. However, the ominous, charcoal-hued clouds of detonating 88 B-17 shells, delivered with relentless precision, pursued the bombers without respite, clinging to their flight path all the way to their intended targets and often beyond. The cold, unfeeling statistical data painted a stark and brutal picture of this aerial warfare. Indeed, nearly 70% of all B-17 Flying Fortress losses sustained over the German Reich were attributable to this devastating anti-aircraft fire, rather than the agile Messerschmitts or the robust Focke-Wulfs of the Luftwaffe. So profound was this fear that bomber crews frequently expressed a preference for confronting a dozen of the most aggressive Luftwaffe fighters over the harrowing ordeal of navigating a concentrated flak barrage, such as those encountered over heavily defended industrial complexes like Schweinfurt or the sprawling factories of the Ruhr Valley. The sheer lethality of flak was not merely a consequence of the immense volume of projectiles hurled skyward. The Germans, with characteristic methodical efficiency, had elevated anti-aircraft defense to a sophisticated scientific discipline. Every significant industrial objective within the Reich's borders was meticulously encircled by formidable batteries of both the ubiquitous 88 mm and the more powerful 105 mm cannons. Yet the true destructive efficacy stemmed from the intricate system that underpinned these formidable weapons. German flak crews did not simply elevate their barrels towards the heavens and rely on chance. Instead, they employed highly advanced predictive technologies. These ingenious devices possessed the uncanny ability to calculate, with startling accuracy, the precise future position of an incoming bomber within the next 30 seconds, meticulously factoring in its current speed, altitude, and directional vector. Consequently, the high explosive shells were already detonating in that exact predetermined segment of the sky by the very moment the targeted aircraft arrived. American bomber tactics, as rigidly adhered to throughout 1942 and into the early part of 1943, inadvertently simplified the task for the German gunners, making their job almost effortless. The Army Air Forces had meticulously crafted a strategic doctrine centered upon the concept of precision daylight bombing, a methodology that inherently demanded protracted, unwavering, and level bomb runs. The celebrated Norden bomb sight, a marvel of optical mechanical engineering, necessitated absolute stability to achieve its legendary accuracy. Any slight deviation or alteration in flight parameters during the critical final minutes preceding the "bombs away" command would irrevocably compromise the precision of the bombing run. Thus, B-17 formations would meticulously stabilize their flight path some 10 to 15 miles distant from the target, lock onto the designated initial point, and then proceed to fly with unswerving resolve, arrow straight at a constant altitude and airspeed until the lead bombardier toggled his release mechanism. Every subsequent aircraft within the formation was then instructed to follow the trajectory of the lead aircraft's falling ordnance. We invite you to stay with us and watch the end of this video. We would be grateful for your like and subscription. Please also take a moment to share, where you are from in your thoughts on the topic discussed in this video. Those agonizing final 3 to 5 minutes of the bomb run stretched into an eternity for the crews. Initially, one would observe the nascent flak bursts materializing ahead, appearing as diminutive black puffs that, from a considerable distance, seemed almost innocuous. Then, with an unsettling swiftness, the formation would plunge directly into the heart of the barrage, and the robust airframe of the aircraft would shudder violently from the concussive force of near misses. Shrapnel, razor-sharp and propelled with lethal velocity, would tear through the thin aluminum skin of the bomber, producing a cacophony reminiscent of hailstones furiously drumming upon a tin roof. Yet, these were no ordinary hailstones. These metallic fragments possessed the devastating potential to sever a vital hydraulic line, instantly incapacitate or kill a waste gunner, or ignite a volatile fuel tank, with catastrophic consequences. The acrid metallic scent of cordite would insidiously permeate the flight deck, seeping in through countless small punctures in the fuselage. And through it all there could be no deviation from the prescribed course. The crews were compelled to maintain their rigid formation, hold their assigned altitude, and steadfastly maintain their heading, even as the German predictors, with chilling mechanical precision, calculated their imminent demise. The sheer predictability of these American bombing runs was proving to be a fatal flaw. Every bombardier required identical conditions, a stable platform, an unobstructed sight picture, and absolutely no evasive maneuvers. Consequently, every pilot meticulously adhered to the same flight profile precisely as dictated by their comprehensive training manuals. The Germans were acutely aware of this operational rigidity. Their discerning flak officers had diligently studied captured American tactics, meticulously timed observed bomb runs, and precisely measured approach patterns from hundreds of previous missions. They understood with certainty that once a B-17 formation committed to its bombing run, it would steadfastly maintain a consistent course at an altitude of approximately 25,000 feet, allowing for only a few hundred feet of variation, and at a steady airspeed of around 180 mph. This invaluable intelligence meant that their sophisticated predictors could be preset with remarkable accuracy, anticipating the bomber's arrival. By the spring of 1943, bomber crews were engaged in grim comparisons of the odds. Fighter attacks, while undeniably terrifying and often brutally effective, were typically brief, intense engagements. A FW-190, for instance, would execute its lightning-fast pass and break away in mere seconds, leaving a fleeting moment of terror. Flak, however, was an entirely different and more insidious threat, impersonal yet relentlessly persistent. It shadowed the bombers through the entire target area, an unyielding curtain of steel fragments that formations were compelled to penetrate simply to accomplish their mission. Some veteran crews recounted flying through barrage concentrations so astonishingly heavy that the individual explosions seemed to merge into a continuous, unbroken roar, a rolling wall of dense black smoke punctuated by searing red-orange flashes, a horrifying spectacle that a formation simply had to endure with stoic resolve. The seasoned veterans would often impart a chilling piece of advice to new, fresh-faced crews. You can't think about it. You strap in, point the nose at the target, and just hope your number isn't on one of those shells. The established doctrine appeared utterly unbreakable. Precision bombing inherently demanded precision flying, yet men were perishing in alarming numbers along those fatally predictable straight lines. Consequently, some pilots began to harbor profound doubts, quietly questioning whether an alternative approach might exist. The very apparatus that rendered German flak so devastatingly lethal was typically housed within robust concrete bunkers, strategically located near every gun battery, the Kommando 40. This remarkable mechanical computer possessed the uncanny ability to forecast the future position of an incoming bomber with astonishing accuracy. This was no mere guesswork or the product of experienced gunners eyeballing the sky. This was pure mathematics rendered tangible, a complex array of gears and cams executing ballistic solutions with a speed far surpassing any human crew's capability. This advanced system represented the absolute cutting edge of fire control technology of its era, and American bomber crews were tragically losing their lives precisely because of its unforgiving precision. The intricate process commenced with the deployment of highly specialized optical rangefinders strategically positioned around each flak battery. These sophisticated stereoscopic instruments, some boasting impressive base lengths nearing 5 meters, were capable of determining the precise distance to a target aircraft at altitudes up to 40,000 feet. Highly trained operators would meticulously track an incoming bomber formation through their precision optics, continuously feeding real-time range data to the Kommando via a network of electrical signals. Simultaneously, other dedicated operators diligently measured the target's azimuth and elevation angle. Thus, 3 crucial streams of data, range, bearing, and altitude, flowed seamlessly into the predictor every few seconds, forming a comprehensive picture of the bomber's movement. Within the complex confines of the Kommando an intricate maze of mechanical calculators sprang into action. The device's capabilities extended far beyond merely recording the bomber's current location. Instead, it meticulously calculated where the bomber would be at the precise moment the anti-aircraft shell arrived at its target altitude. An 88mm round, for instance, fired from an altitude of 25,000 feet, typically required approximately 30 seconds to reach its intended target height. During that critical 30-second interval, a B-17, cruising at an airspeed of 180 km, would traverse a considerable distance of about 1.5 miles. The Kommando painstakingly accounted for this forward movement, along with other crucial variables such as prevailing wind drift, atmospheric air density, ambient temperature, and the specific ballistic characteristics of the ammunition being fired. A symphony of cams and gears meshed together, performing complex calculus through ingenious mechanical analog computation, arriving at a solution with unparalleled speed. The precise output generated by the predictor was then transmitted directly to the gun layers. Dials mounted on each individual 88mm gun received continuous, real-time position updates, the precise elevation angle, the traverse bearing, and the critically important fuse setting. German time fuses in 1943 could be calibrated with truly remarkable precision, down to mere tenths of a second. The Kommando meticulously calculated the exact fraction of a second each shell needed to detonate, thereby ensuring its fragmentation pattern would be perfectly positioned in the bomber's predicted future location. Loaders, working with disciplined efficiency, would then set the fuse rings according to the precise solution provided by the predictor, and the gun would fire. If the bomber maintained its unwavering course and speed, the mathematical calculation would prove to be absolutely perfect, with devastating consequences. A well-drilled and proficient German flak battery possessed the formidable capability to launch 6 rounds per gun into the air every single minute. A typical heavy flak battery comprised between 6 and 8 guns, all meticulously slaved to the same central commando jerret. This translated into a terrifying barrage of 40 to 50 shells per minute, each one meticulously timed to explode in a precisely calculated position within the bomber's flight path. The predictor would continuously update its solution as fresh tracking data arrived, effectively walking the barrage along the bomber's projected flight path. The inevitable result was a lethal box of airspace, densely filled with high-velocity steel fragments, timed to exist in the exact coordinates as the approaching bomber formation. Crucially, this sophisticated system relied upon one fundamental and indispensable requirement. It demanded predictable target behavior. The Commando Garret's intricate calculations were predicated on the assumption that the target aircraft would steadfastly maintain its current velocity vector. Should a bomber abruptly alter its altitude or airspeed, the predictor's meticulously calculated solution would instantly become invalid. However, the Germans possessed a profound understanding of American doctrine. They had meticulously studied captured training manuals, skillfully interrogated prisoners of war, and observed hundreds of bombing missions with keen analytical insight. They were fully aware that once a B-17 formation committed to its bomb run, it would rigidly maintain constant parameters for a critical period of 3 to 5 minutes. The Commando Jerret was, in essence, designed specifically to exploit this inherent and fatal predictability. By the midpoint of 1943, the devastating effectiveness of this system was statistically verifiable over heavily defended targets, such as the port city of Bremen, the industrial hub of Hamburg, and the extensive industrial centers of the Ruhr. Flak batteries were achieving hit rates that would have been utterly impossible to attain with traditional manual gun-laying methods. Post-mission damage assessments conducted on bombers returning to their bases in England consistently revealed that the vast majority of aircraft exhibited damage from flak, and, more tellingly, the shells were consistently bursting at precisely the correct altitude. The fragmentation patterns were not random occurrences. They were arriving exactly where the predictors had calculated they should be. The mechanical brains of the Commando Garret were unequivocally winning this mathematical duel. And American crews, trapped by their own doctrine, had no apparent countermeasure. They were, quite literally, flying by the book directly into a meticulously constructed computational trap, and altering that doctrine seemed an insurmountable challenge. The Norden bomb sight, for all its revolutionary precision, demanded stability, and stability was precisely what the Commando Garret required to execute its deadly work. Clearly, something had to yield. Yet, in the waning days of the summer of 1943, no one yet comprehended what that something might ultimately entail. August 17th, 1943, would forever be etched into the annals of aerial warfare as the day that fundamentally challenged everything. The ambitious double strike against Schweinfurt and Regensburg, two absolutely critical centers for ball bearing and aircraft production respectively, represented the deepest penetration into hostile German airspace the 8th Air Force had ever dared to attempt. The mission planners, fully cognizant of the inherent dangers, had anticipated significant losses, but what transpired over those heavily defended targets far exceeded even their most pessimistic projections. Of the 376 B-17s that bravely departed English airfields on that fateful morning, a staggering 60 aircraft never returned to base. An additional 168 bombers limped back to England so severely damaged that a great many would never be deemed airworthy again. The resulting casualty rate soared to an unsustainable 20%, a figure well beyond the sustainable threshold for any military operation. The Flak encountered over Schweinfurt on that day was unlike anything the battle-hardened crews had ever experienced. Gunners reported barrage concentrations so incredibly dense that the individual explosions seemed to coalesce into an unbroken, continuous black cloud, an almost solid wall of destruction. One pilot from the 381st Bomb Group vividly recounted flying directly into what he described as a literal wall of smoke, where individual bursts were utterly indistinguishable, replaced by a churning, violent mass of shrapnel and blast waves that mercilessly tossed his heavy aircraft around as if it were a mere leaf caught in a tempest. The predictor-directed fire was devastatingly accurate, achieving a horrifying degree of precision. Shells were observed bursting consistently at precisely 23,000 to 26,000 feet, the exact altitude band where the bomber stream was most heavily concentrated. Crucially, the losses were not distributed randomly across the formation. Aircraft, rigidly flying the standard bombing profile, straight, level, and at a constant altitude and airspeed, bore the brunt of the punishment, suffering the heaviest casualties. Lead bombardiers in each group, who were compelled to maintain the steadiest course for the longest duration, suffered disproportionate casualties. The Germans had, with chilling tactical intelligence, learned to concentrate their fire specifically on formation leaders, knowing that disrupting these crucial lead aircraft would effectively scatter and compromise the entire group's bomb pattern. The commando juret predictors were therefore being directed not merely with mechanical precision, but with a profound and lethal tactical understanding. It was not solely about achieving mechanical precision in bombing. Back at the strategic heart of Bomber Command Headquarters, the disquieting statistics arrived with the force of an actual explosion. General Frederick Anderson and his dedicated staff had always conceded that the perilous nature of daylight precision bombing would inevitably incur significant costs. However, the sheer magnitude of these figures hinted that the entire strategic approach might be utterly unsustainable. A straightforward arithmetical assessment laid bare the grim reality if each deep penetration mission consistently resulted in a 20% loss rate, then an individual crew's chances of surviving a full I-25 mission tour plummeted to virtually zero. The established pipeline for replacement personnel simply could not keep pace with such a catastrophic rate of attrition. Training facilities across the United States were already operating at their absolute maximum capacity, yet they proved incapable of producing new crews at a speed sufficient to offset these devastating losses. The second brutal Schweinfurt raid, executed on October 14, 1943, served as a stark and undeniable confirmation of this escalating crisis. This day, forever etched into memory as Black Thursday, exacted an additional toll of 60 bombers completely lost, with a further 17 so severely damaged that they were officially written off. The 8th Air Force had dispatched a formidable force of 291 B-17s to strike the target, and by nightfall, a staggering 77 of these aircraft had vanished, representing a devastating 26% loss rate. While the critical ball-bearing plants had indeed sustained hits, the cost in human lives and material was unequivocally catastrophic. After the profound shockwave of Black Thursday, deep penetration missions were reluctantly and temporarily suspended. The ambitious bomber offensive, which had been envisioned as the crucial precursor to the D-Day invasion, had been brought to a grinding halt by the formidable German air defenses. Intelligence officers immediately commenced meticulous debriefings, diligently searching for any discernible pattern that might elucidate why some aircraft miraculously survived while others tragically perished. They painstakingly examined the flak damage on returning bombers, meticulously noting the precise locations where anti-aircraft shells had detonated relative to the aircraft's position. Pilots and bombardiers were interviewed in exhaustive detail about the exact moments when they had observed the most intense concentrations of enemy fire. Gradually, a subtle yet persistent pattern began to materialize, though it initially appeared to defy conventional wisdom. Some crews reported that the flak bursts seemed to anticipate their future position, exploding slightly ahead of where they were currently flying, as if the German artillery knew precisely where they would be before they even arrived. This was, in fact, precisely what was occurring. The Kommando Gerät, the sophisticated German fire control system, was specifically engineered to place shells in the bomber's projected future position, not its immediate current location. However, this crucial observation ignited a pivotal question in the minds of operational planners. What if the bomber was not in that predicted future position? What if the fundamental assumptions underpinning the predictor's calculations were somehow violated? The prevailing doctrine emphatically stated that any deviation during the bomb run was strictly forbidden. The comprehensive training manuals were explicit and uncompromising on this point. The entire theoretical framework of precision daylight bombing hinged upon the absolute necessity of stability. Yet, courageous men were sacrificing their lives for this very stability, prompting some astute officers to question whether bombing accuracy truly mattered if one did not survive to even glimpse the target. The profound crisis of August and October 1943 had irrevocably opened a significant fissure in the edifice of accepted wisdom, and it was through this very crack that genuine innovation would, in time, begin to emerge. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The initial departures from established doctrine did not originate within the hallowed halls of headquarters, but rather in the cramped cockpits high above Germany. Seasoned veteran pilots, boasting 15 or even 20 missions under their belts, began to place their trust in their own instincts over the rigid dictates of their training manuals. Captain Robert Morgan of the 91st Bomb Group, who would later achieve widespread renown for successfully piloting the iconic Memphis Belle through her entire tour, commenced experimenting with subtle altitude variations during his final approach to targets in late 1943. He was not overtly defying orders, rather, he was interpreting them with a degree of pragmatic flexibility. His bombardier could still achieve acceptable sight pictures, even if the aircraft ascended or descended by a few hundred feet during the critical bomb run. Other crews began to notice something quite peculiar when they implemented these unauthorized adjustments. Lieutenant James McLaughlin, skillfully piloting a B-17 affectionately named Lucky Strike, recounted an incident over Bremen in November 1943 that would become a topic of intense discussion in crew quarters for weeks thereafter. His formation had stabilized onto the bomb run, at a precise altitude of 24,000 feet, when an onslaught of intense flak began to bracket their position. McLaughlin instinctively pulled back on the yoke, gaining approximately 400 feet over the subsequent minute. The flak bursts that had previously been dangerously close suddenly appeared below his aircraft. He had climbed into what should have been an area of even heavier concentration, yet the shells were exploding precisely where he had been, not where he currently was. The explanation for this phenomenon took some time to fully grasp, because it initially seemed counterintuitive. Every pilot's ingrained instinct dictated that one should dive away from flak, seeking to get below it, and utilizing gravity to accelerate out of the perilous danger zone. However, McLaughlin had climbed, and the flak had inexplicably missed. Word of this remarkable observation disseminated rapidly through the 91st and neighboring bomber groups. Some pilots skeptically dismissed it as mere lucky timing, suggesting that perhaps the German gunners had simply adjusted their aim at that precise moment. However, others, driven by a spirit of inquiry, began to experiment, attempting small altitude changes during their bomb runs and meticulously noting where the flak bursts appeared relative to their newly assumed positions. Captain Charles Cruikshank of the 303rd Bomb Group conducted what amounted to informal field testing during missions in December 1943. He would brief his crew before each mission that he might deviate from the standard altitude during the bomb run, and he specifically requested his bombardier to report whether such deviation adversely affected accuracy. On 3 consecutive missions targeting locations in northwestern Germany, Cruikshank initiated gentle climbs of 500 to 800 feet, commencing approximately 2 minutes before bombs away. His bombardier consistently reported that the advanced Norden bomb sight could effectively compensate for the climb rate, provided it remained steady. More importantly, the flak that had been predicted for their original altitude consistently burst beneath them. The underlying physics began to make perfect sense once pilots took the time to logically think it through. Those formidable 88mm shells required a full 30 seconds to reach their designated altitude. If a predictor system calculated that an aircraft would be at 24,000 feet in 30 seconds, but the aircraft was actually steadily climbing at 100 feet per minute, then it would in fact be at 24,500 feet when the shells arrived at their preset altitude. This inherent time of flight created a crucial gap that judicious altitude changes could effectively exploit. The commando grade was indeed extraordinarily accurate, but its calculations were based solely on the aircraft's current behavior. Alter that behavior, and the sophisticated firing solution instantly became obsolete. Initially, not everyone was convinced by these emerging theories. Operations officers voiced significant concerns regarding the integrity of the tight defensive formations. If individual pilots began climbing and descending at will, the meticulously organized defensive boxes would inevitably disintegrate. Group commanders expressed apprehension about bombing accuracy degrading if bombardiers were forced to work from unstable platforms. Some senior staff officers viewed the entire concept as bordering on insubordination, pilots exhibiting unauthorized creativity when they should be rigidly adhering to established procedures. The doctrine itself had been painstakingly developed by highly regarded experts, rigorously tested at bombardier schools, and thoroughly validated in the harsh crucible of combat. One simply did not abandon such established doctrine merely because a few pilots harbored unproven theories. Yet those particular pilots consistently returned from missions when others tragically did not. By January 1944, a sufficient number of mission reports contained mentions of altitude variations and observed flak patterns that intelligence officers could no longer disregard the compelling correlation. Crews that maintained rigid altitude discipline appeared to sustain more hits than those that introduced calculated variations. While this was not definitive scientific proof, it was certainly highly suggestive. The data remained largely anecdotal, scattered across dozens of mission debriefings and individual crew accounts. Nevertheless, a clear pattern was undeniably emerging. The rigid, straight, and level approach that established doctrine demanded might be precisely what the German predictors required to effectively destroy them. Innovation, born from the raw instinct for survival, was beginning to fundamentally challenge the textbook, and the accumulating evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. The life-saving tactic eventually acquired its name from the very action it seemed to defy, climbing into the flak. By early 1944, a sufficient number of crews had experimented with altitude changes that the precise mechanics of this revolutionary technique began to crystallize. It was not about random evasive maneuvers or panicked, uncontrolled climbing. Instead, it represented a calculated and deliberate exploitation of the critical time gap between when German predictors formulated their calculations and when those calculations manifested as exploding shells at altitude. The optimal technique involved initiating a steady climb of 500 to 1,000 feet during the final approach, commencing approximately 3 minutes before the release of bombs. The timing of this maneuver was absolutely critical. Initiating the climb too early would simply allow the German tracking stations to feed the new data into their Kommandogerät, which would then recalculate for the aircraft's altered trajectory. Conversely, starting too late would leave the bombardier insufficient time to establish a stable sight picture before the moment of release. The optimal window appeared to be precisely around the 2.5 to 3 minute mark. At this specific point, German predictors had already established their definitive firing solutions and had begun transmitting fuse settings directly to the anti-aircraft guns. Loaders were actively setting the time rings on shells based on calculations that erroneously assumed the aircraft would still be at its original altitude. Those deadly shells were, at that very moment, already being rammed into the breeches of the guns. The rate of climb was just as crucial as the timing. Pulling back too aggressively on the yoke would disrupt the formation's integrity and present the bombardier with an unacceptably unstable platform. Climbing too gently, however, would fail to gain sufficient altitude to escape the preset burst zone. Experienced pilots discovered that a steady climb rate of 80 to 120 feet per minute yielded the best results. At an average rate of 100 feet per minute, an aircraft would gain 300 feet in the 3 minutes prior to bombs away. An adequate altitude increase to place it well above where the predictor-aimed shells would detonate, yet gentle enough that bombardiers could effectively maintain their sight pictures and accurately adjust their calculations. Meticulously adjust their calculations. Lieutenant William Cassiday, a member of the 384th Bomb Group, meticulously documented in his personal diary a pivotal moment in February 1944, the inaugural instance his aircrew intentionally ascended into the perilous embrace of anti-aircraft fire over Frankfurt. Having stabilized their B-17 for the critical bomb run at an altitude of 23,500 feet, the ominous plumes of the first flak bursts suddenly materialized directly in their flight path. Deviating boldly from established operational doctrine, which mandated maintaining a constant altitude, Cassaday initiated a gradual climb. His co-pilot, understandably, voiced apprehension regarding this unconventional decision as they were deliberately ascending towards the very heart of the black, exploding clouds. Yet Cassaday maintained his unwavering resolve, holding his climb rate steady at approximately 90 feet per minute. The anti-aircraft fire that had initially been detonating at their original altitude soon began to appear harmlessly below them. Ultimately, they successfully released their payload from a new elevation of 24 to 200 feet, and remarkably, the entire formation sustained no losses over the target area, with every single aircraft returning safely to base. The underlying physics of this audacious maneuver proved effective due to an inherent shortcoming within the sophisticated German fire control system. While the Kommandogret could compute astute determinations with brilliant precision, it lacked the capacity for instantaneous recalculation. Once critical tracking information was input into the predictive apparatus, and a preliminary firing solution was consequently generated, there existed a consequential lag of between 20 and 30 seconds before updated data could be fully processed into a subsequent computational cycle. Meanwhile, ordnance, equipped with pre-calibrated fuses, was already loaded into the anti-aircraft guns and discharged. These shells were, by their very nature, unavoidably committed to exploding at a predetermined elevation, calculated solely from outdated positional data. Consequently, should the aerial target have strategically altered its altitude during that crucial processing and firing interval, the shells would inevitably detonate harmlessly in the void of any material impact. Furthermore, the inherent delay associated with the shell's trajectory from ground to target added yet another layer that bolstered the defensive efficacy of this tactic. To offer an illustrative example, an 82 mm anti-aircraft shell, propelling itself from ground level towards a target at 25,000 feet, possessed a flight time roughly spanning 28 to 32 seconds, a duration contingent upon prevailing atmospheric pressure and temperature. During this critical 30-second ascent, a B-17 bomber, strategically ascending at a rate of 100 feet per minute, would gain an impressive 500 feet in altitude. A significant discrepancy thus emerged. The incoming shell would arrive at the projected point of interception where the predictor had calculated the bomber would be, but the bomber would in actuality be 500 feet higher. The lethal shrapnel pattern from the bursting shell would then expansively disperse in a conical fashion below the aircraft, with the most dangerous fragments traveling horizontally or downward from the burst point. Therefore, by consistently climbing, the aircraft was effectively elevating itself beyond the zone of critical danger. After 2 or 3 paragraphs, ask us to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Aircrews soon began articulating their observations of this peculiar flak phenomenon in visual terms that served to vividly illustrate the concept. They would recount watching shells bursting at what appeared to be their current altitude, yet those explosions were in reality marking their actual location moments prior. A perceptive navigator aptly likened this experience to watching a series of footsteps chase you up a staircase, with each explosion marking precisely where you had just been, but with the comforting assurance that you were consistently maintaining a decisive lead, always one step ahead. The psychological impact of this realization was profoundly transformative. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by an inescapable onslaught, pilots felt empowered by a sense of agency, convinced they were actively outmaneuvering the sophisticated German fire control system. They were ingeniously leveraging the very precision of the predictor against its inherent vulnerability. The sophisticated Kommandogerät system, despite its inherent accuracy, nonetheless continued to compute with flawless precision, but crucially, it was calculating for an aerial target that had physically departed those specific spatial coordinates. Consequently, by the advent of March 1944, this innovative altitude variation maneuver had transcended its initial phase as an isolated experimental procedure, elevating its status to a standardized, group-wide operational doctrine. Colonel Curtis LeMay, the distinguished commander of the 3rd Bomb Division, stood prominently among the initial high-ranking officers to officially sanction this novel technique. After meticulously scrutinizing mission debriefs and casualty figures, LeMay had already cemented his formidable reputation on a foundation of tactical innovation. He had, for instance, pioneered the renowned combat box formation that gave B-17s overlapping defensive firepower, and possessing a keen eye for practical advancements, he promptly identified the merit of this field-originated innovation. Consequently, his pivotal operations order, issued on March 12, 1944, vested commanding officers of individual groups with the authority to implement these dynamic altitude adjustments during critical bombing sorties, accompanied by precise directives concerning optimal initiation timings and ascent velocities. However, the integration of this new methodology was not entirely devoid of opposition. Adherence to established protocols among operations officers strenuously contended that any departure from a perfectly stable flight path would fundamentally jeopardize the meticulous precision that served as the very rationale underpinning the audacious daylight bombing strategy in the first place. They posited that if American bombers were to endure substantial casualties by operating in daylight, in stark contrast to the Royal Air Force's nocturnal operations, such sacrifices necessitated unparalleled targeting accuracy. Notably, Major Harold Bowman, stationed at 8th Bomber Command Headquarters, dispatched a formal memorandum in early April, expressing profound reservations about the potential for altitude alterations to diminish the circular error, probable ICEP, the statistical measure of bombing accuracy, to an unacceptably detrimental degree. The communiqué formally advocated for a provisional suspension of the tactical modification, pending comprehensive evaluations and trials at dedicated bombardier training installations situated within the United States. Nevertheless, the front-line combat personnel had, through empirical evidence, already definitively concluded this contentious discussion, demonstrating demonstrable operational outcomes. Experienced bombardiers unequivocally confirmed that, provided the ascent velocity was maintained at a constant pace and not surpassing a ceiling of 120 feet per minute, the sophisticated gyroscopic stabilization and rate compensation mechanisms inherent to the Norden bomb sight were fully capable of accommodating the adjustment. The bombardier's procedure was straightforward, simply calibrating the rate control knobs to integrate the climb as an additional dynamic factor, akin to managing variables such as lateral wind displacement or fluctuating air velocity. A notable instance was that of Lieutenant Thomas Farabee, who would subsequently garner significant renown as the bombardier aboard the iconic Enola Gay, having participated in numerous sorties with the 384th Bomb Group, employing these ascending maneuvers and reliably achieving bomb dispersion patterns well within the permissible tolerances of the intended target's central point of impact. In response to these compelling findings, existing training protocols underwent swift and comprehensive adaptation. Consequently, newly deployed air crews, arriving in England during the spring of 1944, were thoroughly briefed, integrating the altitude variation technique as an intrinsic component of their routine target approach methodologies. The directives provided were remarkably precise, stipulating the commencement of a sustained ascent approximately 150 seconds prior to the projected bomb release point. Furthermore, maintaining a consistent climb rate, ranging from 80 to 110 feet per minute, was imperative, ensuring this velocity remained unwavering to furnish the bombardier with a stable and predictable platform for accurate targeting. Moreover, lead bombardiers, entrusted with orchestrating the synchronized release of ordnance for entire formations, were afforded expanded discretion to fine-tune the initiation of this maneuver, informed by real-time observations of enemy flak concentrations and discernible German tracking tactics. The widespread adoption and dissemination of this tactical innovation throughout the entirety of the 8th Air Force unfolded in a remarkably organic fashion, primarily facilitated by the interconnected dynamics of the bomber stream itself. It became common practice for air crews to keenly observe adjacent flight groups successfully implementing these climbing maneuvers, subsequently noting their markedly diminished vulnerability to anti-aircraft fire during post-mission debriefings. Upon their return to base, pilots frequently engaged in informal exchanges, sharing insights and experiences regarding the practical effectiveness of various operational adjustments. A particularly compelling illustration of this tactic's efficacy became the widely recounted experience of the 91st Bomb Group during their mission over Brunswick on April 8, 1944. This particular group initiated a pronounced ascent from an initial elevation of 24,000 feet to a final altitude of 25,200 feet throughout their critical bomb run. In stark contrast, neighboring formations steadfastly preserved their predetermined flight levels. The climbing contingent reported only 4 aircraft sustaining minor damage from anti-aircraft fire, with none experiencing critical impairment. Conversely, the groups that adhered to a constant altitude suffered the grievous loss of 3 bombers, and an additional 11 aircraft incurred substantial damage. Such stark and undeniable discrepancies, propagated through the ranks with unparalleled velocity, far outstripping the pace of any formal communication or directive. In an ongoing pursuit of enhanced effectiveness, certain operational groups began to devise nuanced variations upon the foundational altitude change methodology. For instance, the 305th Bomb Group undertook experimental maneuvers involving a climbing turn, which ingeniously integrated a gradual increase in elevation with a subtle alteration in flight path during the critical final minute leading up to ordnance release. This innovative approach introduced a crucial lateral displacement in addition to the vertical one. thereby significantly exacerbating the complexity of enemy predictor calculations. Conversely, other units explored step climbs characterized by holding a specific altitude for approximately 30 seconds, followed by a rapid ascent of 200 feet, and then resuming a level flight segment. However, the prevailing consensus that gradually crystallized advocated for the superior efficacy of a consistent, uninterrupted ascent. The rationale behind this preference was clear. The intermittent nature of step climbs inadvertently furnished German tracking personnel with discernible patterns, which could, to some extent, be integrated into their predictive systems, whereas the steady, continuous climb incessantly presented an ever-evolving stream of data, rendering it far more challenging for their analog computers to process into genuinely accurate firing solutions. As May 1944 unfolded, and the logistical and strategic preparations for the monumental Normandy invasion reached a fever pitch, the innovative altitude change technique had firmly established itself as the unequivocal standard operating procedure throughout the vast majority of the 8th Air Force's operational bomb groups. Official mission planning documentation now meticulously incorporated specific climb initiation points and designated target climb altitudes with the same meticulous detail previously reserved for defining initial approach points and precise bomb release lines. Furthermore, nascent pilots, freshly arrived from training facilities in the United States, were thoroughly indoctrinated in this technique during their inaugural orientation flights, predating even their first actual combat sorties. What had initially materialized as an unconventional and unauthorized departure from established doctrine had, through proven efficacy, ascended to the status of doctrine itself. This represented a profound tactical evolution within the bomber force, a testament to its remarkable adaptability in confronting a sophisticated enemy fire control system, which only a few months prior had been relentlessly inflicting devastating losses upon aerial formations. Critically, this transformative adaptation did not originate from top-down, high-level strategic directives, but rather emerged organically from the collective, hard-won experience of countless air crews who ingeniously discovered a practical method to circumvent the very mathematical principles that had been designed to bring about their demise. Unsurprisingly, the German defenders were far from oblivious to the significant alterations unfolding in the contested skies above their national territory. By the onset of summer 1944, a chorus of reports from Flak battery commanders began reaching their high command, indicating that American bomber formations were conspicuously abandoning their previously predictable flight trajectories during critical bombing approaches. Concurrently, astute Luftwaffe intelligence officers conducted thorough interrogations of captured B-17 air crews, thereby gaining crucial insights into the precise altitude change tactics that had by then been wholly integrated as standard operational procedure. The pressing strategic dilemma that subsequently presented itself was whether the formidable German fire control systems possessed the requisite agility and speed of adaptation to effectively counteract this unforeseen and rapidly evolving shift in American aerial strategy. In response to these emergent challenges, the dedicated Commando Jurat predictor crews diligently endeavored to implement a series of countermeasures. The most immediate and ostensibly logical remedy involved augmenting the regularity of tracking data updates. Consequently, instead of transmitting positional information to the predictor at intervals of 8 to 10 seconds, operators made concerted efforts to expedite this process, aiming for updates every 4 to 5 seconds. The underlying theoretical premise was robust, positing that a higher frequency of incoming data would enable the mechanical computing device to discern subtle altitude variations more promptly, thereby facilitating the recalculation of firing solutions before ordnance was irrevocably committed to its trajectory. However, in the crucible of operational reality, the inherent limitations of human endurance became starkly apparent. The skilled operators found it impossible to sustain such an accelerated tempo with consistent reliability. The demanding task of optically tracking an elusive bomber at an extreme altitude of 25,000 feet while simultaneously vocalizing precise measurements every mere few seconds inevitably induced severe fatigue and a corresponding proliferation of errors. Ultimately, the integrity and accuracy of the input data suffered a noticeable degradation as operators were compelled to rush their intricate tasks. The efficacy of the German anti-aircraft system was diminished when the crews operating it were under pressure to act swiftly. German engineers in response meticulously investigated potential enhancements to the commandogerate fire control system itself. Consequently, a selection of flak batteries were equipped with more sophisticated predictors, which incorporated supplementary computational mechanisms specifically engineered to ascertain the rate of climb of incoming aircraft and integrate this crucial data into the generation of firing solutions. These improved systems, officially labeled Commandogerate 40Com41, started to be deployed at vital defensive strongholds, protecting key locations such as Berlin and the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley during the middle of 1944. While these advancements offered a slight advantage, they ultimately proved incapable of surmounting the inherent issue of time delay. Despite the benefit of more precise computations, anti-aircraft shells still necessitated a full 30 seconds to ascend to the required altitude, a period during which attacking bombers could typically increase their elevation by approximately 500 feet. Although the predictor was designed to estimate the ascent rate, any subsequent alteration to that rate by the bomber, or a cessation of its climb, rendered the initial estimate inaccurate and ineffective. A further strategy explored to counteract the bomber's evasive tactics centered on modifying the fuse settings of anti-aircraft shells to generate a more profound vertical pattern of explosive bursts. Customarily, the established procedure involved configuring fuses for exact altitude detonation, which produced a horizontal dispersion of fragmentation. However, German ordnance specialists engaged in trials with a system of staggered settings. Certain shells were programmed to detonate at the anticipated altitude, while others were calibrated to explode 200 feet above this point, and yet more were set for a detonation 400 feet higher. This innovative approach aimed to construct a vertical ladder of explosions, specifically designed to encompass a bomber that was actively ascending. The formidable 88mm batteries tasked with safeguarding the vital Luna refineries utilized this method extensively throughout their engagements in September 1944. While this tactic undeniably augmented the sheer quantity of shrapnel projected into the airspace, it concurrently diminished the concentration of destructive force at any single altitude, paradoxically resulting in a reduction of the probability of scoring a direct hit against individual enemy aircraft. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please leave a comment below about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Remarkably, the most impactful counter tactic developed by the Germans was not a technological marvel, but rather a strategic adjustment in procedure, initiating engagement sooner. Anti-aircraft batteries commenced firing upon incoming bomber formations from significantly extended distances, typically engaging them at ranges of 8 to 10 miles from their intended targets, as opposed to their previous practice of delaying engagement until the formations were within 5 miles. This proactive approach compelled American pilots to initiate their evasive climbing maneuvers much earlier in their approach trajectory. Consequently, this afforded German tracking personnel an extended duration to observe the evolving altitude changes and to input updated data into their predictor systems. Certain batteries reported enhanced accuracy using this revised methodology, especially when defending heavily fortified objectives, such as the synthetic oil production facilities at Leona. Nevertheless, the consequence of these increased engagement ranges was that shells had to traverse a greater expanse of atmosphere, which inevitably diminished their inherent accuracy and overall destructive potential, even when the fuse settings were calibrated precisely. Furthermore, German military doctrine underwent a notable transformation, moving towards the implementation of barrage fire across pre-calculated zones, rather than maintaining the meticulous precision tracking of individual aircraft. This strategic pivot signified a conceptual departure from the advanced fire control mechanisms that had rendered the commando-jet system so lethally effective. Rather than meticulously computing exact interception points for each target, anti-aircraft batteries would instead inundate expansive volumes of airspace with a deluge of shells, deployed at diverse altitudes and with varying fuse configurations. This particular technique became colloquially known as flak carpets among bomber crews, a vivid description for the impenetrable, dense fields of explosive bursts that an entire formation was compelled to traverse, irrespective of any changes in their flight altitude. This revised operational strategy, however, entailed an extraordinary consumption of ammunition and necessitated the deployment of significantly larger concentrations of artillery, vital resources that Germany's progressively worsening industrial capacity rendered increasingly challenging to supply. By the autumn of 1944, the overall efficacy of German anti-aircraft defenses had demonstrably diminished, even in the face of augmented gun deployments safeguarding crucial objectives. Comprehensive statistical assessments conducted by 8th Air Force Intelligence revealed a marked reduction in bomber loss rates attributed to flak, receding from the devastating levels experienced in late 1943 to more manageable and sustainable figures. Combat sorties that might have resulted in the loss of 20 aircraft in 1943 were, by this later period, incurring casualties of only 8 or 10. It is important to note that the altitude change maneuvers were not the sole contributing element. An escalation in fighter escort capabilities, refined aerial formations, and a decline in the quality of German crew training also played significant roles. Nevertheless, the tactical adjustments undeniably contributed to a palpable reduction in the predictor system's overall effectiveness. Despite these challenges, the commando-jet system persisted as a formidable instrument of warfare until the conflict's conclusion, especially potent during instances when American formations committed operational errors or when mechanical malfunctions compelled bombers into flying more predictable trajectories. Yet it never recaptured the absolute mathematical precision and predictive certainty it had exhibited in 1943. The significant technological superiority it once afforded had been neutralized, not by the advent of superior American technology, but rather through astute tactical innovation and adaptation. The attacking bombers had not triumphed over the sophisticated predictor system through advanced engineering. Instead, they had effectively circumvented its capabilities by simply declining to operate in the predictable manner that the system's original designers had fundamentally presupposed. The efficacy of the strategy involving climbing into the flak became definitively measurable once a sufficient volume of mission-specific data had been amassed to facilitate rigorous analysis. Subsequent to the war, comprehensive investigations undertaken by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey meticulously scrutinized the casualty rates both prior to and following the extensive implementation of these altitude change maneuvers. The collected information unequivocally conveyed a consistent narrative. Bombing sorties executed during the initial half of 1944, which incorporated these climbing techniques, demonstrated a reduction in flak-related losses ranging approximately from 15 to 30% when juxtaposed with comparable missions conducted against similar objectives in the latter part of 1943. While the precise variation was contingent upon the specific target defenses encountered and the proficiency with which formations executed their climbs, the overarching statistical pattern remained beyond dispute. Further, more detailed proof was furnished through the examination of individual bomb group records. The 100th Bomb Group, notoriously dubbed the Bloody Hundredth due to the catastrophic losses it sustained throughout 1943, experienced a significant amelioration in its casualty figures subsequent to the formal adoption of specific climbing protocols in March 1944. From March through August of that same year, this particular group undertook 87 combat operations, recording a loss rate of 3.2% per mission, a figure still indicative of considerable peril, yet markedly superior to the unsustainable attrition rates witnessed during the preceding year. Captain Robert Rosenthal, the group's operations officer, largely ascribed this notable improvement to the synergistic application of altitude-changing tactics alongside enhanced fighter escort. Veterans from this group who endured the war consistently cited the climbing technique as a crucial element that provided them a viable opportunity for survival against flak directed by sophisticated predictor systems. The profound impact of this innovative technique extended beyond merely enhancing immediate survival probabilities. It fundamentally reshaped the perception of vulnerability among bomber crews. In the grim year of 1943, anti-aircraft fire had been perceived as an indifferent, inescapable force, something akin to an act of nature that simply had to be borne. However, by the middle of 1944, crews had arrived at the crucial realization that they possessed the agency to actively mitigate its threat through skilled and appropriate flying maneuvers. This significant psychological transformation held immense importance for the overall morale of the airmen. Pilots consequently felt less like passive, helpless targets caught in a deadly storm, and more like active contenders engaged in a dynamic tactical engagement. Accordingly, training curricula began to underscore this newfound sense of empowerment. Freshly assigned crews were instructed that their role transcended merely piloting heavy bombers. They were, in fact, operating within an intricate environment of electronic and mechanical warfare where their judicious decisions possessed the potential to neutralize adversary systems. The enduring legacy of this climbing into the flak tactic resonated far beyond the cessation of World War II. Officers engaged in Air Force tactical development meticulously analyzed the technique's demonstrable success as they formulated operational doctrines for bomber deployments in subsequent military engagements. The core tenet that purposefully introducing elements of unpredictability into flight characteristics could effectively circumvent prediction-based fire control systems subsequently became a cornerstone principle for all evasive aerial maneuvers. In the course of the Korean War, crews piloting B-29 superfortresses, confronting Soviet-engineered radar-guided anti-aircraft artillery, effectively utilized adapted versions of the altitude alteration technique. The underlying physical principles remained constant, notwithstanding the evolution of predictor systems from rudimentary mechanical calculators to nascent electronic apparatuses. The advent of the jet age did not diminish the pertinence of this crucial lesson. During the protracted Cold War, Strategic Air Command's B-52 bomber crews were rigorously trained in terrain-following penetration profiles, deliberately fluctuating their altitude without cease to confound the targeting computations of Soviet surface-to-air missiles. Although these missiles possessed significantly greater velocity than the 88mm shells and employed electronic rather than mechanical guidance, the fundamental principle endured. Maintaining a constant altitude rendered an aircraft predictable, and predictability proved fatal. Contemporary, terrain-following radar systems and sophisticated automated flight control mechanisms now execute the identical core concept that B-17 pilots empirically ascertained over the skies of Germany, to remain unpredictable within the operational strictures of assigned mission parameters. Even within the contemporary epoch characterized by stealth technology and advanced standoff weaponry, the intrinsic tactical essence of climbing into the flak continues to resonate. Present-day strike mission blueprints heavily underscore the importance of diversifying ingress trajectories, meticulously avoiding any flight paths that might be anticipated, and integrating abrupt jinking maneuvers during the conclusive stages of an assault. While the precise methodologies have naturally progressed in tandem with technological advancements, the foundational reasoning remains steadfast. Adversary fire control mechanisms, whether they are archaic mechanical predictors or sophisticated phased array radars, fundamentally necessitate predictable target conduct to attain their peak operational precision. By deliberately withholding that predictability, their overall effectiveness is inevitably compromised and degraded. The compelling narrative of B-17 pilots purposefully ascending into the path of anti-aircraft fire encapsulates a significance far greater than merely a singular tactical breakthrough. It serves as a potent illustration of the adaptive capacity inherent within military organizations when established doctrine confronts the stark realities of combat and reality ultimately prevails. The United States Army Air Forces had dedicated substantial resources towards the meticulous development of a doctrine centered on precision daylight bombing. This doctrine had undergone rigorous testing, subsequent refinement, and formal codification. Within official training manuals, it constituted the officially sanctioned and approved methodology for conducting aerial operations. However, when this established approach began to exact an intolerably high toll on air crews, the organization demonstrated sufficient flexibility and responsiveness to undergo a necessary evolution. Crucially, this transformative innovation originated from the operational ranks, from the very pilots and crews who placed greater faith in their direct combat observations than in the precepts outlined in their training manuals. The successful adoption of this adaptation was largely attributable to the fact that leadership across various echelons recognized the validity of this grassroots battlefield innovation and facilitated its widespread dissemination. Figures such as General Curtis LeMay and other commanding officers possessed the authority to demand unwavering adherence to established doctrine, potentially even court-martialing pilots who diverged from approved operational protocols. Instead, they judiciously scrutinized the empirical evidence, acknowledged the demonstrable effectiveness of the new method, and subsequently formalized these successful practices. This profound organizational flexibility, the inherent readiness to absorb lessons and insights from those actively engaged in the conflict, may well have been as pivotal to ultimate success as the tactical maneuver itself. The efficacy of a particular military maneuver, or indeed any high-stakes operation, often hinges not merely on the execution of prescribed steps, but critically on the ability of those involved to adapt and innovate under duress. This profound truth was strikingly demonstrated during the tumultuous aerial campaigns of World War II, where the ingenuity of individual crews proved as vital, if not more so, than the officially sanctioned tactical blueprints. It was in the crucible of combat that airmen, facing seemingly insurmountable odds, discovered novel methods to preserve their lives, a testament to human resourcefulness in extremis. In a remarkable display of adaptive thinking, these airborne personnel devised an unconventional countermeasure to the lethal precision of enemy anti-aircraft fire. Instead of adhering rigidly to standard operating procedures that often dictated a steady course through predicted danger zones, they chose a radical departure, ascending directly towards the source of the exploding shells. This counterintuitive maneuver, which involved flying into the very path of the destructive ordnance, was initially met with skepticism. Mathematical models and established military doctrine unequivocally declared such a strategy to be not only impossible from a survival standpoint, but fundamentally incorrect according to all strategic principles. The predictor's calculated kill zone was designed to trap and destroy, and conventional wisdom dictated avoidance, not direct engagement in this manner. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Yet, despite the formidable objections from theoretical calculations and entrenched military tenets, the hard-won experience of those who returned offered irrefutable proof. This audacious, seemingly suicidal approach yielded results. Thousands of airmen, against all statistical probability, successfully navigated their perilous missions and returned safely to base from the skies over World War II battlefields, precisely because someone had the courage and insight to challenge the prevailing wisdom. This extraordinary episode forged a powerful and enduring legacy, underscoring a critical lesson for all endeavors that established manuals and approved procedures, while foundational, are not infallible. True survival, particularly in dire circumstances, frequently necessitates a willingness to innovate and deviate from the script, irrespective of what the official guidelines dictate.